Hello and welcome back to another episode of Jefferson's Salute to the Presidents. I'm Thomas Watson, and trust me, I feel like a nut. And this little guy is my travel companion and star of the show, Thomas Jefferson. This is a very special episode because TJ and I not only pay tribute to the life of our 20th president, James A. Garfield, but we also do it with the help of my granddaughter and the sweetest 11-year-old in the world, Reese Fiscelli. So without further delay, please sit back, maybe grab a bowl of squirrel stew, Garfield's favorite, and enjoy the show. James Abram Garfield was born on this site in Orange Township, now Moreland Hills, Ohio, on November 19th, 1831. I'm standing on one of the three windows in the cabin, which not only represented the cabin where Garfield was born, but it was also built from logs once used in an 1830s, 1840s horse barn. James lived here on his family's farm until 1856. Even though this cabin was a replica, Garfield was the last president born in a log cabin. This life-size bronze statue of a youthful James Garfield, with books in one hand and a farming hoe in the other, accurately depicted one of the hardest working young men who would later become president. After I was carried along a trail for a quarter-mile behind the replica cabin, I found the actual birthplace site of James Garfield, which was marked by this boulder. When James Garfield was born here on November 19th, 1831, his mother Eliza said of her newborn son, "The largest babe I ever had. He looked like a red Irishman." Not only did the future president weigh 10 pounds at birth, but he also had a massive head and torso with short, stubby legs. When I was set down in the leaf-filled vegetation within the outline of the cabin site, I was immediately overcome by where I was standing. For it was here where young James first learned to walk at 9 months of age, and a month later, the boy was climbing ladders. Garfield was intelligently advanced, so much so, in fact, the lad was reading as a 3-year-old. But because James was fatherless before the age of 2, he grew up in poverty and was ridiculed by other boys off the farm. Garfield later recalled, "I was made the ridicule and sport of boys that had fathers and enjoyed the luxuries of life." This is what Garfield's birthsite looked like when I made my first visit on May 19th, 2019. Great improvements were made to the site over the next 5 years by the Garfield Trail Committee, headed by Tim Garfield, the great-great-grandson of the president. After attempting to work on a canal boat, which failed, Garfield left home for good at the age of 17. Although he spent 2 years at the Geauga Seminary, James ended up at the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in Hiram. While studying at what's now called Hiram College, 20-year-old James Garfield assisted Deacon Zeb Rudolph in building this house, known today as Buckingham Place. It turned out Zeb had a daughter named Lucretia, who was also a student at Hiram, and she was very smitten with young Garfield. During my visit to Buckingham Place on November 15th, 2024, I met Tim Garfield, the president's great-great-grandson, for the first time. For the past 172 years, this home has served as a family residence, housing for students, and the residence of many Hiram College presidents. Let's go through the doorway behind me and visit the home James Garfield helped build. The oak floorboards where I'm standing inside Buckingham Place were tongue and grooved and installed by 20-year-old student James Garfield in 1852. As I stood on the floor and thought about the future president as he laid the boards in place one by one, I looked to the other side of the room and saw Tim Garfield standing on the same flooring. This historic building in front of me was built in 1842 as the Mecca Community Church in Mecca, Ohio. The building was purchased by Hiram College in 2007 and moved to the campus a year later. It turned out James Garfield, who later became known as the Preacher President, once delivered sermons at that church in Mecca in the late 1850s or early 1860s. When I posed on a table inside the historic building, which today hosts a political science class at the college, it was easy to see the original oak support beams throughout the structure. Since that church was constructed in 1842, I figured the trees which the beams had been cut from were alive when the Declaration of Independence was signed. And while I thought about James Garfield during my time inside the former church, the president's great-great-grandson was never too far away. Roughly 1 week before James's 27th birthday, he married 26-year-old Lucretia Rudolph in Hiram on November 11th, 1858. James A. Garfield won a seat in the Ohio State Senate in 1859 and served from January 2nd, 1860 until August 21st, 1861. During his time in the state Senate, Garfield praised abolitionist John Brown as a hero and said his execution shall be the dawn of a better day. At the same time, Senator Garfield did not condone Brown's bloody raid at Harper's Ferry. Garfield served in the United States Army during the Civil War from August 1861 to December 1863. This well-worn field desk alongside me accompanied James Garfield through Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi as he served in the Western Theater of the American Civil War. James Garfield won election into the United States House of Representatives while still in uniform in 1862 during the Civil War. At the urging of President Abraham Lincoln, Garfield left the service and took his seat in the United States House of Representatives. Garfield took the oath of office on March 4th, 1863, and served in the U.S. House for the next 17 years. I was honored for the chance to stand on the desk used by Garfield during his time in the House of Representatives. The historic house behind me was built in 1853 for the original owner, Horace Brown. 9 years later, in November 1862, Brown rented the house to the newly elected congressman from Ohio, James Garfield, and his wife, Lucretia. The Garfields loved the place and purchased the home in April 1863 while the congressman general was still in battle during the Civil War. Three of the Garfield's first five children were born in this house, including James Rudolph Garfield, who became the Secretary of the Interior in the Theodore Roosevelt administration. Over the years, owners and visitors have experienced paranormal activity believed to be James and Lucretia Garfield inside the home. While standing on the porch, I couldn't wait to get inside where I had hoped to experience the reputed paranormal activity for myself. I figured the grand piano in the parlor would be a good place to stand and listen for ghostly sounds, but not one spirit tickled my ivories. I love posing on fireplace mantels because they are usually original to the home. Did the future president ever light a stogie from a burning ember in this fireplace? It was at this moment, as I looked at Tim Garfield standing nearby, when I thought about Tim's famous ancestor standing on the same hardwood floor. This upstairs room was likely the master bedroom where James and Lucretia once slept. I couldn't believe my luck when I was placed in an original antique chamber pot. It was a privilege for me to pose with my photographer's granddaughter, Reese Fiscelli, who dressed in period clothing to honor Lucretia Garfield. At one point during our visit, Reese heard two distinct knocks on a doorframe in this room. The 11-year-old believed the knocks were a sign from President Garfield. Garfield had penned this farewell letter to the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute on June 24th, 1853. Even though the letter was over 170 years old, I was able to read every eloquently inscribed word on the single sheet of paper. The letter began with farewell and continued with the time has arrived when our sojourn together for many bright days must now draw to a close. I'm standing in front of the Charles G. Learned House, which was constructed in Port Austin in 1837 on what was known as the edge of the wilderness. Learned, a New York businessman, and his wife Maria purchased the estate in 1859, and he opened several businesses in Port Austin soon after. Around 1866, Learned constructed a large addition to the house, which was around the same time U.S. Congressman James Garfield visited his friends Charles and Maria in Michigan's Thumb. For the rest of that decade, Garfield became a frequent visitor at this home, which today is known as the Garfield Inn. James A. Garfield purchased his Mentor farm in 1876, which was built in 1832 and consisted of 118 acres. Within a year, the congressman added 11 rooms and an additional 40 acres of land. When Garfield acquired this farm, now known as Lawnfield, he wanted a place where I can touch the earth and get some strength from it. He also wanted a place to teach his boys about hard work and farming. Congressman Garfield also felt this house would be a perfect place to reside when Congress was in recess during the hot summer months. I'm standing on the impressive porch at Lawnfield. It was from this same porch where Congressman James Garfield delivered dozens of campaign speeches during the summer and fall of 1880, which helped him get elected as our 20th president. Let's walk through the front door and visit Garfield's beloved home, known as Lawnfield. This was the entrance hallway inside Lawnfield. During the 1880 campaign, Lucretia stood in this hallway and greeted visitors, including former President Ulysses S. Grant, who had come to see her husband. I'm standing in the parlor at Lawnfield, located inside the front entrance on the first floor. The portrait behind me is of James's mother, Eliza, whom he adored. In September 1880, James Garfield sat in this parlor with Ulysses S. Grant, Senator Roscoe Conklin, and Senator John Logan and hammered out their differences within the Republican Party. The meeting was called the Treaty of Mentor. The piano in the far corner of the parlor was a 13th birthday present to daughter Molly. I'm posing in the first floor summer bedroom used by James and Lucretia. The secretary desk in the corner was owned and used by the president. I'm in the first floor bedroom of Eliza Garfield, the president's mother. Eliza was the first mother of a president to live in the executive mansion with her son. There were 7 images of James Garfield in this room. The Garfield's dining room table was outfitted with Christmas dinner during our mid-November visit. James often gave his kids spelling tests while the family sat at this table for dinner. The president's favorite meal was squirrel stew. The tiles around the dining room fireplace were original and painted by Lucretia Garfield and several of her children. The plates and dishes in the cabinet were used by the Garfields in the executive mansion. When I was carried upstairs, my first stop was in the Memorial Library, which was added by Lucretia in 1885. The piano directly behind me belonged to the Garfield's oldest son, Harry. The ornate desk to my far left was a Wooten desk created for President Garfield by the Wooten Desk Company. Owner William Wooten had made similar desks for Ulysses S. Grant and Rutherford B. Hayes. I'm always impressed by a nice bust, and the bust of James Garfield behind me was created by American artist Preston Powers and presented to the president's widow following the assassination. I'm standing in the fireproof vault Lucretia had constructed in the Memorial Library. The wreath above me was sent to the family by Queen Victoria on behalf of the English people and displayed during President Garfield's funeral. Lucretia had the wreath sent to Chicago where it was preserved in wax. The area where the Christmas tree stood in front of the bay window was where a dual family wedding took place on June 14th, 1888. Molly Garfield married Joseph Stanley Brown, and Harry Garfield married Belle Mason in a ceremony held in the Memorial Library. This upstairs bedroom was where the Garfield's youngest sons, Irvin and Abram, slept. The boys were 8 and 10 years old when their father was elected president. Now I'm in the Garfield's winter bedroom, which was located on the second floor of Lawnfield. The portrait on the far wall was Edward, who died before the age of 2 from whooping cough. When Lucretia returned to Lawnfield following the death of her husband, she used this room as her primary bedroom. I'm standing in the upstairs snuggery, which was used as James Garfield's office and study. A congressman went to this room to escape the reporters, and he loved to sit in his favorite reading chair to relax with a good book. After serving 17 years in the U.S. Congress, Garfield was elected to the Senate in January 1880. But a presidential campaign was in order first, as he was nominated by the Republican Party to be their delegate for the presidency. James Garfield turned this building, once used as his library, into his temporary campaign headquarters in 1880. Garfield had a temporary telegraph system installed inside his campaign headquarters where he could communicate with party leaders and supporters around the country. Garfield conducted much of his successful and precedent-setting front porch campaign at Lawnfield. As a matter of fact, the name Lawnfield came from the hundreds of reporters who camped out on Garfield's lawn to get the latest news of his campaign. Garfield, during his 1880 front porch campaign with his mother, wife, and daughter Molly. This silver water pitcher was gifted to James Garfield in October 1880 during his presidential campaign by a Chambersburg, Pennsylvania hose brigade. In the 1880 election, Garfield defeated Democrat Winfield Scott Hancock 214 electoral votes to 155, even though the pair were only separated by 1,898 popular votes. After he was elected president in November 1880, Garfield left Lawnfield for Washington, D.C. on February 28, 1881. He would never return to his beloved farm. James A. Garfield recited the presidential oath of office on the east portico of the U.S. Capitol on March 4, 1881. Just 3 days before his inauguration, Garfield scrapped his original inaugural speech and rushed to rewrite a new one. Exhausted by several sleepless nights of writing, his highly anticipated speech failed to live up to expectations. Everyone knew Garfield was a great writer and speaker. However, he left his friends and audience a bit disappointed. Inauguration of James A. Garfield, March 4th, 1881. During Garfield's inauguration, Chief Justice Morrison Waite administered the presidential oath of office. which was recreated in the museum located behind Longfield in Mentor. I'm standing over the Bible used by Garfield when he recited the presidential oath of office. These shoes and hat were worn by James Garfield on Inauguration Day, 1881. This display I'm standing above featured a program for Garfield's inaugural ball on March 4, 1881, as well as the President's inaugural address inscribed by Rutherford B. Hayes. Once in the executive mansion, President Garfield quickly went to work when he enforced presidential authority over the traditional courtesy given to the Senate in making executive appointments. The Senate was famous for giving friends and contributors good jobs. President Garfield took that perk away from them. The new president also sought to build a canal through Panama and also wanted to reduce British influence in the Kingdom of Hawaii. First Lady Lucretia Garfield. Built in 1879 in Long Branch, the St. James Protestant Episcopal Church was where 7 presidents had worshiped when they visited the Jersey Shore. Presidents Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Benjamin Harrison, McKinley, and Wilson all worshiped in this church, now known as the Church of the Presidents. President Garfield arrived in Long Branch to visit his wife, who was recovering from a life-threatening case of malaria. On June 19, 1881, the President and First Lady attended the Sunday service in this church. A few days later, the President returned to Washington without his wife. However, he planned on returning in early July for a vacation. I'm in the middle of Constitution Avenue near 6th Avenue, called B Street in 1881, which is the site once occupied by the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station. I got lucky and didn't get run over while posing in the middle of one of Washington's busiest streets. On the morning of July 2, 1881, President Garfield arrived at the train station where he was scheduled to head for New Jersey on vacation. At 9:30 a.m., as the president was speaking with Secretary of State James G. Blaine inside the station, Charles J. Guiteau pulled out his concealed .44 caliber British Bulldog revolver and shot Garfield twice at point-blank range from behind. The Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station where President Garfield was shot. The assassination of James A. Garfield, July 2, 1881. Charles J. Guiteau. This hat, on display alongside me, was worn by James Garfield when he was shot twice by Charles Guiteau. The president had been shot twice, once in the arm and once in the back. The president was immediately taken to the executive mansion where he remained bedridden while his doctors probed for the bullet. Unfortunately, the doctor's unsterilized hands and equipment made matters worse, and Garfield became weaker when he developed an abscess in the wound. The president suffered throughout August as the heat had become unbearable. By the end of that month, Garfield's weight had decreased from 185 pounds down to 130. In early September, the decision was made to transport the dying president out of Washington to Long Branch, where Lucretia had recovered earlier in the summer. Garfield left the executive mansion for good on September 5, 1881. He was transported by a specially cushioned rail car. This bed I'm standing on was designed for him to lay on during transport, but he refused to use it. Located in the Elberon section of Long Branch, New Jersey, the small monument behind me marks the location of the Franklin Cottage where James Garfield arrived on September 6, 1881. The Franklin Cottage. When a friend assured the mortally wounded president that he had much work still before him, Garfield replied, "No, my work is done." Those were President Garfield's last words. James A. Garfield died at the age of 49 at 10:35 p.m. on September 19, 1881, at this site in Elberon, New Jersey. The death of James A. Garfield, September 19, 1881. When the Franklin Cottage burned down in the 1920s, the site was ignored until the 1950s when this small granite memorial was placed on the property. This small 10-foot by 10-foot cabin, now known as the Garfield Tea House, was built by William Presley shortly after President Garfield had died. New York City stage actor Oliver Byron purchased the spikes, ties, and planks used for the emergency railroad tracks that had been put in place to transport the wounded president from the Elberon station to the Franklin Cottage. When Byron had the tea house built, he said that since Garfield was born in a log cabin, this cabin was a fitting tribute. The cabin first stood in the yard of Byron's summer cottage until his death. This small cabin is now located on the property of the Church of the Presidents in Long Branch, New Jersey. Following his death, the body of President Garfield was transported by train from New Jersey back to Washington, D.C., where the president laid in state in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. President Garfield laid in state on this spot in the Capitol's rotunda on September 22nd and 23rd, 1881. Garfield mourned by President Arthur in the Capitol. President Garfield's coffin in the Capitol's rotunda. After Garfield's casket had arrived at the public square in Cleveland for public mourning on September 25, 1881, the president's remains were transported to Lakeview Cemetery. The mausoleum of Levi Schofield in Cleveland's Lakeview Cemetery was used as Garfield's temporary tomb until the president's permanent resting place was completed in 1890. Garfield's remains were guarded 24 hours a day while entombed here until they were moved to the permanent monument in 1890. On May 20th, 1890, The coffin of President Garfield was interred in the basement crypt inside the newly constructed James A. Garfield Memorial. The final resting place of President Garfield, located in Cleveland's Lakeview Cemetery, was dedicated on May 30th, 1890. The impressive James A. Garfield Memorial is 180 feet high. When Lucretia Garfield passed away on March 13, 1918, at age 85, she was interred alongside her husband 4 days later. Follow me up the steps and into my favorite presidential gravesite. Once I was carried through the huge steel doors and into the memorial, I came face to face with this 12-foot tall marble statue of our 20th president. I'm standing at the entrance to the crypt in the lower section of the Garfield Memorial. I was nervous standing here because of all the paranormal experiences I had encountered over the years. I'm in the crypt room inside the memorial. The flag-draped coffin to my left contains the remains of President James A. Garfield. The body of Lucretia Garfield is in the bronze coffin, while the two urns to my left contain the ashes of the president's daughter Molly and her husband Joseph Stanley Brown. Garfield's casket is the only presidential coffin which is permanently in full view. During my first visit in 2013, my head was mysteriously removed after posing in the crypt. And 2 years later, a woman who claimed to have special powers held me between the bars where she felt the spirit of Garfield all around me. And in 2019, my photographer's phone suddenly began to play a mysterious song while he was setting me on the floor inside the crypt area. There's no doubt in my resin mind the Garfield Memorial is haunted, which is why it's my favorite presidential gravesite and the reason I keep coming back. On November 15th, 2024, I met Tim Garfield, the great-great-grandson of President James Garfield. November 16th, 2024, I was excited to visit the tomb of our 20th president with my photographer's granddaughter, Reese Fiscelli. After all, This was Reese's first visit to a presidential gravesite. Well, that's it for another fun-filled episode. Reese, TJ, and I hope you've enjoyed the show and learned a little bit about the life of one of our favorite presidents, James A. Garfield. Please do the three of us a favor and subscribe to this channel so you won't miss any of our goofy antics. And while you're at it, hit that like button below. If you'd like to read about all of our exploits and travels, please check out our blog. You can find it at eyesofjefferson.com. Our next show will feature Jefferson's tribute to President Chester Arthur. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to set some peanuts out in your yard to feed the squirrels. So long.